Everything changed the moment the palace system blinked, and one name didn't just disappear, it was quietly disabled. Not removed in public, not announced with ceremony, not debated in parliament, just gone from where it mattered most. Internal records, digital protocol, the invisible machinery that defines who is in and who is out. And suddenly, Meghan's no longer active, no longer functional, no longer recognized behind the walls where real decisions are made. Because this wasn't noise. This wasn't rumor for headlines. This was something colder, quieter, and far more deliberate. Everything just collapsed. That's how insiders are describing it now. Not a single dramatic explosion, but a chain reaction. One decision triggering another until there was nothing left to hold the illusion together. And the deeper you go, the darker it gets, because what looked like a simple title restriction suddenly begins to feel like part of something much bigger, something planned, something that didn't start yesterday. Behind the scenes, the palace doesn't move fast, it moves precisely. Every adjustment, every silent update, every line rewritten in those internal systems follows a pattern. And according to whispers coming out of staff corridors, something changed recently. Not publicly, not visibly, but internally, a classification was altered, a status was shifted, a privilege paused then disabled. And the question nobody can ignore anymore is this: why now? Because this didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing like this ever does. It started small, almost forgettable. A meeting here, a quiet absence there, invitations that didn't arrive, protocols that suddenly didn't apply. And at first, it looked like the same old tension everyone had already gotten used to. But then the pattern changed. It became coordinated. People inside began noticing inconsistencies, names appearing differently across internal documents, access permissions being quietly adjusted, not removed completely, but limited, restricted, compartmentalized, like someone was testing boundaries, slowly tightening them, watching how far they could go before anyone noticed. And then came the moment where it stopped being subtle. The messages told a story, not the kind released to the press, not the polished narrative meant for public consumption, but a different story. One of decisions being made behind closed doors, of conversations that didn't leak because they weren't meant to exist outside those rooms. A story of someone preparing, not reacting. Because when insiders say this move has William's fingerprints all over it, they're not talking about a dramatic declaration or a royal decree. They're talking about strategy. Quiet, calculated, patient strategy. The kind that doesn't need headlines to work. Think about it. If you wanted to remove influence without triggering backlash, you wouldn't announce it. You wouldn't make it public. You'd change the system itself. You'd redefine what's recognized and what isn't. You'd make it so that even if the title exists on paper, it stops functioning in reality. And that's exactly what this feels like. Because while one side was focused on maintaining appearances, holding on to the identity, the branding, the symbolism, the other side was adjusting the structure underneath it, quietly, consistently, until one day the surface and the system no longer matched. And when that happens, the illusion breaks. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this isn't just about a title. Titles are symbols. What matters is what they unlock: access, status, recognition, authority. And when those things are removed internally, the title becomes decorative. Something you can say but not use. Something you can claim but not activate. And insiders are starting to whisper that this is exactly what's happened. That Meghan's her hasn't been dramatically stripped, it's been deactivated. Like a key card that still exists but no longer opens any doors. And that's when everything shifted emotionally, not just politically. Because when you realize something you've built your identity around is no longer functioning the way it used to, the reaction isn't quiet. It can't be. It's explosive, unpredictable, impossible to contain. The confrontation wasn't just about the present moment, it was about years of tension, years of positioning, years of trying to control a narrative that may have already been slipping away behind the scenes. Because here's the detail people keep missing: systems don't change overnight unless they've been planned for a long time. And if this internal disable is real, even partially real, it means conversations were happening long before anyone noticed. It means scenarios were being mapped out. It means someone anticipated this moment and prepared for it, which brings everything back to one person. William, not in the loud, confrontational way people expect, but in the silent, strategic way that reshapes outcomes without ever needing to explain them. Because while the public watches statements and interviews, the real power operates in policy, in structure, in quiet decisions that don't need approval approval from headlines. And suddenly, his silence doesn't look passive anymore. It looks intentional, because while others were talking, reacting, defending, explaining, he wasn't engaging at all. And that absence, it's starting to feel less like distance and more like control. Because if you control the system, you don't need to control the conversation. And now the conversation is catching up, because people are starting to connect the dots. The restrictions, the absences, the shifts in protocol, the subtle changes that didn't make sense individually but now form a pattern when seen together. A pattern that leads to one conclusion: this wasn't a reaction, it was a move. A move designed to avoid chaos, avoid backlash, avoid confrontation, while still achieving the same end result. Because removing something publicly invites resistance. Removing it quietly rewrites reality before anyone has time to respond. And that's what makes this so unsettling. Because if it's true, if the true status has been effectively disabled inside the system, then the question isn't what was taken away. And the deeper this goes, the more unsettling it becomes. Because once you accept that something inside the palace system has already shifted, you're forced to confront the next question: what else has been quietly adjusted without anyone noticing? And how far does this silent restructuring actually reach? Because insiders aren't just pointing to one isolated change, they're hinting at a ripple effect, a slow recalibration of roles, access, and recognition that doesn't need public confirmation to be real. And that's where the tension sharpens into something almost impossible to ignore. Everything just collapsed. Meghan found text messages proving Harry planned this affair for months. But wait, it gets much darker. New evidence shows he's been orchestrating multiple scandals for years. Not a victim, completely complicit. Because what's unfolding here doesn't sit in isolation, it connects. It overlaps, it builds into a larger picture where personal chaos and institutional control start to mirror each other in ways that feel too precise to be coincidence, and suddenly the idea that one side was losing control while the other was tightening it becomes harder to dismiss. The more instability appears on the surface, the more deliberate the structure underneath begins to look. And that contrast alone is enough to raise questions no one inside the palace seems willing to answer directly. This changes everything you thought you knew about both of them. Here's what actually happened. It started simple. A phone on the table, a notification lighting up, just a text from an unknown contact. Something small, something easy to ignore, except it wasn't ignored. And that single moment began unraveling something far more complicated than anyone expected. Because when the surface narrative begins to fracture, it exposes the underlying mechanics. And that's exactly where the situation becomes uncomfortable. Because the same pattern keeps appearing, decisions happening quietly, systems adjusting silently, reality shifting without explanation, and every time it happens, it points back to the same possibility that this wasn't reactive, it was premeditated, mapped out long before the public ever sensed something was wrong. When he could finally be free, when he could finally escape, the messages told a story of someone already emotionally detached, someone operating on a different timeline, making deliberate choices while presenting something completely different outwardly. And that duality is what makes this entire situation feel less like chaos and more like controlled divergence. Because the same duality appears inside the palace structure itself. One version visible, one version operational, one narrative public, one reality internal, and when those two stop aligning, the consequences don't explode immediately, they settle, they embed, they become the new normal before anyone has time to question them, and by the time the questions start, the answers have already been decided behind closed doors. He was meeting this woman while Meghan thought he was in meetings, presenting one version of reality while living another, carefully compartmentalizing everything. And that level of control doesn't happen accidentally. It requires planning, precision, and the confidence that the system around you won't immediately expose it. And that's exactly what makes the palace shift feel so deliberate, because it mirrors that same controlled compartmentalization, except this time it's institutional, not personal. And instead of emotions driving the outcome, it's structure, protocol, and silent authority shaping the result, creating a scenario where something can effectively disappear without ever being publicly removed. Harry had a girlfriend, not a fling, a real ongoing involvement. And that revelation didn't just trigger a reaction, it exposed a deeper instability, the kind that doesn't stay contained, the kind that forces everything around it to adjust, to respond, to recalibrate, whether publicly or privately. reality, and that's where the connection becomes impossible to ignore. Because while one side was dealing with emotional fallout, the other side may have already been executing structural changes, quietly aligning the system with a future where certain roles, certain privileges, certain identities simply no longer function the way they once did, and that shift, once completed, doesn't need explanation because it doesn't ask for permission. And that's the part that lingers, because if Meghan's status has truly been disabled internally, then what we're witnessing isn't the moment it happened, it's the moment it's being noticed. And those are never the same thing, because by the time something like this becomes visible, it's already been in motion long enough to be irreversible. Which brings everything back to the silence, because silence in this context isn't absence, it's confirmation without words, it's control without exposure. It's the kind of response that doesn't escalate tension but quietly resolves it in one direction. And once that direction is set, everything else begins to fall into place around it, whether anyone acknowledges it or not.